I mistakenly called the alien girl gorgeous. She turned red and said, "Say it again, human." The warning alarm was still ringing when Corporal Ethan Cole grabbed the fire suppression handle and yanked it hard. Smoke poured from the rear compartment of the shuttle, and the whole vessel shuddered like it had been hit by something enormous, because it had. Whatever that thing was that clipped their stabilizer fin, it was gone now, spinning off into the dark. But the shuttle was not going to last much longer. "Cole, I need a status report. Now." Lieutenant Owen Pratt's voice crackled through the headset, tense but steady. He was at the controls fighting to keep the nose up, his knuckles pale where he gripped the stick. "Port thruster is gone. Starboard is at 40%. We've got a coolant leak in the secondary engine bay, and the hull temp on the underside is climbing." Ethan read off the numbers as fast as he could, keeping his voice flat. Panic was not going to help anyone right now. "How long before we have to put her down?" 7 minutes, maybe 8 if we're lucky." Owen let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "We're not lucky. Pull up the nearest landmass on the nav system." Ethan pulled it up. The planet beneath them, designated Renova 6 in the Colonial Registry, was technically uncontacted territory. It had been flagged for observation only, pending first contact protocol clearance. The clearance had not come through. Which meant that, when this shuttle dropped through the atmosphere and planted itself in whatever forest or valley was waiting down there, they were going to be the first 2 humans to ever set foot on the surface. That was not a distinction either of them had asked for. The descent was rough. The shuttle screamed through the upper atmosphere like it was angry at the planet for existing, and Ethan gripped his harness with both hands and said nothing. Owen fought the controls with everything he had, using the remaining thruster in short bursts to bleed speed and keep the nose from pitching too far forward. They came down through cloud cover that glowed orange from their heat and broke through into a sky that was a deep, bruised purple. Below them was a wide valley, dense with trees that had tall silver trunks and canopies that shimmered like they were made of foil. The whole world beneath them glittered in a way that seemed indifferent to the fact that it was about to have a burning shuttle dropped onto it. "I see a clearing," Owen said. 2 o'clock. "I see it go." Owen banked hard and pushed the nose down. The clearing was not big enough, not really, but it was what they had. The shuttle came in low and fast, clipping the tops of 3 trees before the landing gear made contact with the ground. They bounced twice, hard enough that Ethan bit his own tongue, and then the belly of the shuttle scraped across the earth with a sound like 1,000 nails on metal, and they were down. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan sat in his harness and listened to the sounds the shuttle made as it died, a series of decreasing mechanical complaints, the hiss of something leaking, the deep ticking of cooling metal. The smoke inside the cabin thinned slowly. Through the cracked viewport he could see the silver trees at the edge of the clearing, their foil-like leaves catching the purple light and throwing it back in small shards of brightness. The world outside was completely still. No movement, no sounds he recognized. Just the alien quiet of a planet that had never had a human on it. He unclipped his harness. "Comm array is gone," Owen said from the front, already checking his systems. "Beacon is on battery backup. It'll ping, but it's going to be a while before anyone triangulates us out here." "How long?" 48 hours minimum, could be 72. Ethan got up carefully, tested his legs both fine, and moved to the rear compartment to assess the damage up close. The secondary engine bay was a mess. One panel had blown inward. The coolant line was dripping something that was not going to be a fire risk, but was also not going to stop on its own. He found the emergency supply crate under a toppled equipment rack, got it clear, and started checking what they had. Standard survival load. Food packs for a week, 2 sets of cold weather gear, a field medical kit, a camp stove, 2 emergency blankets, a portable water filtration unit, and the kind of basic tools that could fix small problems but not a destroyed shuttle. "We've got a week of supplies," he called forward. "That's more than enough margin." "Good." Owen came through from the cockpit, ducking under a buckled section of overhead panel. He looked at the damage and made the same face Ethan had made. "We'll set up camp outside. Fresher air." "Yeah," Ethan lifted one end of the supply crate. "Give me a hand with this." They were getting the crate to the cargo bay door when Ethan heard Owen go very quiet behind him. Not the quiet of someone thinking. The quiet of someone who had just seen something that stopped his brain from working properly. He turned around. She was standing just outside the open cargo bay door, at the edge of the ramp, watching them with eyes that were large and pale silver and shaped nothing like a human eye. She was tall, taller than Ethan by nearly half a foot, with a build that was lean and balanced in the way that suggested she did not stand still very often. Her skin was a deep gray blue, and her hair, if you could call it that, was made of something finer than fiber, almost like filaments of light that shifted color when she moved, silver mostly, with threads of pale gold when the light caught it at certain angles. She wore close-fitting clothing that looked functional rather than decorative, dark and matte, with what appeared to be tools or equipment clipped to a belt at her waist. Her hands were visible. She was not holding anything. She was not pointing anything at them. She was just looking. Her expression was still in the way that a held breath is still. She was not tense. She was not afraid. She was watching them with the concentrated attention of someone doing something she had been waiting a long time to do. Ethan Cole, who had been in 3 combat deployments, who had survived a reactor breach on a deep space station, who had once talked a very angry smuggler down from shooting him by speaking calmly about the weather for 9 minutes straight. Ethan Cole looked at this alien girl, standing in the low purple light of an uncontacted world, and the first thing that came out of his mouth was the truth. "You are gorgeous." He said it the way a person says something they did not mean to say out loud, the kind of thing that goes from thought to air without passing through any kind of filter. The thought was, "She is the most striking thing I have ever seen in my life." The thought did not ask for permission before it became words. Owen made a sound beside him that was not quite a word and not quite a breath. The alien girl did not move. For 2 full seconds, nothing happened. Then her skin changed. It started at her neck and spread upward, a flush of deep red that moved through her gray-blue complexion like heat spreading through metal. Her pale silver eyes went wide. Her chin tilted down slightly, and she looked at Ethan with an expression that he could not read at all, not because it was blank, but because it was too full of something he did not have a frame for. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was not confusion. It was something he had no word for, something that looked very much like a person who has been handed exactly what they came looking for, and is now trying to decide what to do with it. Then she said, in a voice that was lower than he expected and oddly precise, as if she had learned the words from a recording. "Say it again, human." Ethan opened his mouth. Owen grabbed his arm. And somewhere above them, through the shimmer of silver trees and the deep purple sky, the rescue beacon blinked its patient, lonely signal into the dark, and the planet that had never had a human on it waited to see what would happen next. They stood there for a moment, the 3 of them, in the strange suspended quality of a thing that has just begun and does not know yet what it will become. Ethan could smell the cooling metal of the shuttle behind him and something from the forest ahead, not quite sweet, not quite sharp, something entirely new that his brain had no category for. The wind moved through the silver trees and made that shimmering canopy hum softly, like something between a breath and a note. He thought about protocols. He thought about first contact procedures, about the documents he had read and the training he had received, and all the careful, measured language that was supposed to govern moments exactly like this one. He thought, none of that prepared me for her. And then he thought something simpler, which was, I have no idea what I just started, but I do not think I made a mistake. The next 4 words Ethan said were not, "You are gorgeous." They were, "My name is Ethan." He said it carefully, the way you say something when you are not entirely sure how much the other person understands, but you want them to know you are not a threat. He kept his hands visible. He kept his body language open. He spread his fingers slightly, palms out, which was the closest thing to a universal signal he had. He spoke slowly and at a normal volume, not louder, because louder would not help her understand and would probably make him seem afraid or aggressive. The alien girl stared at him. The red flush in her skin had not faded. It had softened slightly, from that startling crimson to something closer to rose, but it was still there, still visible in the way that made Ethan deeply aware that he had caused it. She seemed unbothered by it. She did not try to hide it or dismiss it. She just let it sit on her skin like something that had a right to be there. She pressed one hand flat against her own chest, fingers spread, and said something in a language that he did not recognize, 2 syllables, musical, rising slightly at the end. The tones in it were precise in a way that suggested tone might carry meaning, not just emotion. "Is that your name?" he asked. She looked at him steadily and said the 2 syllables again, with a small additional gesture, pointing to herself, and then to the sound she had made, making the connection explicit. "Okay," he said, "I'm going to try." He attempted the sounds. He got approximately half of it right. The second syllable came out wrong in a way he could hear but not fix. Something in the middle of his mouth was not hitting the right position. The tone at the end rose when it should have flattened or flattened when it should have risen. He was not sure which. Something happened in her expression. Not a smile. Her face was not built for the shape of a human smile. But something shifted in the area around her eyes and mouth that felt like amusement, warm and genuine rather than condescending. She tried his name in return, deliberately getting the vowels slightly wrong in the same spirit, giving him the same imperfect rendering he had given her. Ethan felt something ease in his chest. That was a good sign. That was a very good sign. Owen behind him exhaled slowly. "She's playing," he said quietly. "She's already playing with you." It was the beginning of something. Over the next hour, they established a fragile but real language of gesture, repetition, and patient trial. She was intelligent in a way that made itself immediately obvious, not in the flashy way of someone performing cleverness, but in the quiet way of someone who processed everything and discarded nothing. When Ethan held up an object and said its name in English, she repeated the word once exactly and did not need to hear it again. She filed things away instantly. When she held up an object and named it in her language, she watched his face while he tried to repeat it, and she could read, from some subtle signal in his expression, whether he thought he had gotten it right or wrong. She would nod or gently correct without any sign of frustration. Her patience was the kind that comes not from effort, but from genuine interest in the project. Her own language, from what he could tell, was tonal in ways that English was not, which made accurate repetition nearly impossible for him. She seemed to understand this quickly and adjusted, finding simpler constructions when she spoke to him directly, shortening phrases, choosing words with less tonal complexity. She was not dumbing things down. She was engineering a bridge from her end. He was engineering one from his. They were working toward the middle. She had come from the tree line. That much was clear. She had been alone, or at least she had approached alone, and she had come forward with confidence rather than caution. Whether there were others nearby was something Ethan could not determine yet, and he was not going to press the question too hard. She would show him what she wanted to show him when she was ready. What he could determine, she had been watching the shuttle come down. She had waited at the tree line for some time before approaching. There were marks in the soft ground near the trees that suggested a period of standing still. She had come forward when she saw them moving around inside the shuttle, doing practical work, rather than immediately when they first emerged. That meant she had been assessing them. She had decided that people who moved around fixing things were less of a threat than people who stood still and looked at the horizon. That was smart. That was exactly what he would have done. Owen managed to get the camp stove working about 40 minutes into the exchange, which produced the smell of instant soup. The alien girl's reaction to that smell was one of the more purely comic things Ethan had seen in a long time. She froze completely, all that graceful stillness sharpening into something that was very close to suspicion. Her posture changed, not threatening, but alert, her weight shifting forward slightly, every sense redirecting toward this new variable. Then she leaned forward just slightly, and her nostrils, narrow vertical slits on either side of a flat, broad nose, flared twice in rapid succession. She looked at the stove, she looked at the cup, she looked at Ethan. He held the cup out toward her, not close, just in her direction, tilted slightly so she could see what was in it. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked back at him with an expression that said, "You actually eat that." He took a sip, made no face, put it back down. She did not take the cup. She probably never would. But she stopped looking at the stove like it was a threat and went back to sorting through the word collection they had been building together, which Ethan counted as a diplomatic success of the first order. He was running a check on the shuttle's structural integrity later in the afternoon, mostly making sure nothing was going to shift overnight and create a problem, when Owen called from the other side of the hull. "Cole, come look at this." He came around. Owen was crouched beside a section of the underside where the scraping from the landing had peeled back a panel and exposed the internal strut work. Behind the panel, bent into the support strut in a way that made Ethan's stomach do something uncomfortable, was the main power coupling for the stabilization array. "That bent on impact?" Ethan asked, crouching beside him. "It was already bent. Look at the angle," Owen pointed. The bend was precise, clean, like something had applied exactly the right amount of force at exactly the right point. An impact from landing would have produced a different kind of damage, more chaotic, with secondary stress fractures around it. This was surgical. This bent before we hit the ground. Something hit us up there, and I don't think it was debris. Ethan looked at the damage for a long moment. He thought about the moment of impact up in the atmosphere, the single precise strike that had taken out the stabilizer. He thought about how they had not tumbled, had not lost full control, had come down hard but survivable. He thought about all the ways that a strike designed to actually destroy them would have looked different. He looked up. The alien girl was watching them from near the camp stove, arms loosely at her sides, expression calm. He thought about the altitude at which they'd been struck, the precision of the hit, one blow, exactly where it would do the most damage without immediately destroying the vessel. The fact that they had survived a very dramatic crash without a single injury. "You think something shot us down?" he asked Owen quietly. "I think it's possible. And then someone shows up at our crash site within a couple of hours." Owen was quiet. He turned a small piece of the broken coupling over in his fingers. "I'm not saying it's connected. But you're not saying it isn't." Ethan stood up and turned back toward the alien girl. She had not moved. Her pale silver eyes were on him, calm and completely steady, and the last traces of that red flush had finally faded from her skin. She looked like someone who was waiting for a question she already knew the answer to. He walked back to her slowly, held her gaze, and said, as evenly as he could manage, "Did you know we were coming?" She did not understand the words. She could not have, not yet. But she understood the question in his face, the shift of his eyes toward the shuttle, the way his voice carried something that was more than curiosity. People are people, he had always believed. You could not speak every language, but you could read every face. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked away, not guiltily, not evasively, but deliberately, the way a person looks away when they have decided not to answer yet. It was a careful, considered choice, and he could see the consideration in it. She was not hiding. She was waiting for a better moment. Owen crouched down and found the coffee he'd set aside and said nothing. The wind moved through the silver trees and made that shimmering sound. The beacon blinked, patient and invisible above them, sending its signal into a sky that was going darker by degrees, the purple deepening toward black in layers, like something being slowly painted. Ethan stood there and revised his understanding of the situation completely. This was not an accidental encounter. He did not know yet what it was instead, but he was going to find out, and he was going to do it the same way he had done everything else in the past several hours, which was one careful step at a time with his hands visible and his intentions clear. He also noted, with the part of his brain that never completely stopped observing things, that she had chosen to look away rather than lie. That told him something important about what kind of person she was. There were 100 ways to avoid answering a question: denial, distraction, deflection, a pleasant blank expression that revealed nothing, and she had chosen the one that was closest to honesty. She had said, without words, "I am not going to answer that right now, and I am not going to pretend the question was not asked." That was not the behavior of someone who was deceiving him. That was the behavior of someone who was being careful, which was a very different thing. Deception creates distance. Careful honesty is a kind of respect. It says, "You deserve the truth, and I will give it to you when the moment for it arrives." He filed it away. He was going to need to understand the distinction properly when they finally had the language to discuss it. He sat back down near the stove and picked up the word building again, and she came back to it readily, with the same focused interest she had brought to everything since the moment she had appeared at the cargo bay door. The evening came in soft and purple around them while they worked, the light changing slowly, the silver trees going from shimmering to glowing as the sun dropped behind the hills, as if the trees saved their warmth for the end of the day and released it all at once. Owen made dinner from 2 food packs and a packet of dried fruit, and ate it with the patient expression of a man who had eaten worse things in worse circumstances, and was not going to complain. Vea watched the preparation of the food with the same cautious curiosity she had brought to the soup, and after some time accepted a packet of dried fruit from Ethan's hand. She turned it over several times and examined it from several angles, and then, in a gesture so precise it had to be deliberate, placed it exactly where he had put it, untouched, with a small nod that he interpreted. Correctly he thought as, "I see the offer, I am noting it, and I am declining it for now without prejudice." He appreciated the clarity enormously. Clear communication was clear communication regardless of what language it was in. The stars came out above the silver trees, more of them than any sky he had ever navigated by, dense and unrecognized, forming no patterns he knew. He sat in the quiet light of the camp stove with an alien girl across from him and Owen doing something useful in the background, and thought, 3 days ago I did not know this world existed. Now I am sitting in it, and I think I want to know everything about it. He thought that was probably a good sign. The night on Renova 6 came fast, faster than he expected, as if the planet kept a different kind of schedule than the ones he was used to. The purple sky deepened toward something close to black, and the stars, when they appeared, were not in any configuration Ethan knew. A lot of them, far more than most skies he had worked under. Thick in bands, like someone had spilled light across the sky and then decided more light was needed and spilled it again. The effect was almost disorienting. That much of the sky taken up by stars, that much brightness available in a dark that did not feel like the dark he knew. The alien girl sat down cross-legged near the camp stove with a posture that said she had decided to stay, and that was simply that. She did not ask permission. She did not look for approval. She arranged herself comfortably on the ground, crossed her legs, placed her hands in her lap in a way that suggested this was her habitual resting position, and went back to the work of language with the same focused attention she had brought to everything else throughout the long afternoon. As if the night were not a transition but simply a continuation, as if staying were the obvious thing. Ethan thought, "I have questions. I am going to have to find ways to ask them that she can actually understand. That is going to take time, and time is what we have." And then he thought something else, something quieter that he did not say out loud. "She picked this clearing, she picked this encounter, she picked me." He was increasingly interested in why, and he was increasingly aware that the why, when he finally understood it, was going to change something about how he understood himself. By the second morning, Ethan had learned 12 words in her language, and she had learned 43 in his. He had tried to keep count of hers but lost track sometime around hour 6 when she started combining words. She already knew into phrases he had not taught her, which was both impressive and slightly humbling. The human language was, apparently, not particularly difficult for her. Or rather, she had a mind that was particularly suited to it. She learned the way some people play music, by ear, by instinct, by something that looked less like effort and more like recognition. Owen had stopped pretending not to be entertained by the entire situation. He was sitting nearby with a field notebook, drawing phonetic approximations of her language sounds and cataloging which gestures seemed to correspond to which concepts, occasionally underlining something with the enthusiasm of a person who is discovering something and knows it. He was doing real work, the kind that would matter later, when proper linguistic teams arrived and needed a foundation to build on. But he was also clearly having the best time he had experienced in a very long time, which was fair, because this was extraordinary. "You know," Owen said over coffee that morning, while Ethan was failing for the fourth time to correctly reproduce a particular sound that required a placement of the tongue he could not find without thinking about it, and which disappeared the moment he thought about it. "If this ever gets officially documented, this is going to go down as one of the most unusual first contacts in recorded history." "Because we crashed?" Ethan asked, still focused on the sound. "Because of what you said when she showed up." Ethan pointed at him without looking up. "Don't." Owen held up both hands and went back to his notebook with the expression of a man who is exercising tremendous self-restraint and knows it, and is quietly proud of himself for it, and is going to say nothing. Her name, as best Ethan could now render it, was something close to Vea. It was not exactly right. There was a quality in the middle of it that his ears could hear, but his mouth could not reproduce. Some combination of tone and resonance that apparently required a different architecture than the one he had been born with. But she had accepted this approximation with that same subtle shift around her eyes that he was beginning to recognize as her version of a patient smile. She used it on him fairly often. He had gone from finding it mildly embarrassing to finding it something else entirely, something he was not ready to name precisely, but which he was aware of in the way you are aware of something that is going to matter later. He was being honest with himself about this, at least. On the second morning she did something she had not done the day before. She spoke at length. A full paragraph of her language, directed at Ethan, with clear pauses at what seemed like sentence breaks and a deliberate modulation of tone that suggested she was trying to make it as comprehensible as possible. He caught two words he recognized. One of them was the sound she made for sky, which they had established the day before while pointing at the purple above them, and one he thought might be the sound she had made earlier for purpose, though he was not certain, and the rest washed over him in musical, tonal waves that he could appreciate without understanding. He looked at her steadily when she finished. "I got about 4% of that." She looked back at him, reading his face, and seemed to conclude from it that this was an honest assessment rather than false modesty. She nodded once. Then she stood up, turned, and walked toward the tree line. She paused at the edge and looked back, waited. Owen said very quietly, "I think she wants us to follow her." "I got that part," Ethan said. "Are we going to?" Ethan picked up his field jacket, checked his sidearm out of habit and left it holstered. He was not going to draw on her. He had decided this the moment she had appeared at the cargo bay door the previous afternoon, and nothing that had happened since had changed his mind. She had stayed the night. She had shared the work of language with him for hours. Whatever she was leading them toward, he was going to walk into it with both hands in view and his eyes open and his gun exactly where it was. "We're going," he said. The forest was denser than it looked from the shuttle. Up close, the silver trees were enormous, some of them wider than the shuttle's wingspan at the base, with root systems that arched out of the ground in great curves before diving back in, creating a kind of natural architecture at ground level. You had to navigate through these root arches, which meant you were constantly ducking and stepping, and the ground between them was soft and layered with something that was not quite moss and not quite lichen, but had the same quiet quality of growth that preferred to be unobserved. The foil-like canopy filtered the light into something cool and shifting, like being underwater, and the sound of the wind through those leaves was unlike anything Ethan had heard before. A kind of sustained, harmonious hum that changed pitch as the wind changed speed. It was not unpleasant. It was the opposite of unpleasant. It had the quality of something composed rather than accidental. Vea moved through it like she belonged to it, which, obviously, she did. She picked her path without looking down, her body adjusting automatically to the terrain, reading the ground through the soles of her feet in a way that spoke to a lifetime of moving through this specific landscape. She set a pace that was quick enough to be purposeful, but not so quick that they had to rush to keep up. She was aware of them behind her. She checked back twice, not anxiously, not the checking of someone uncertain whether they are being followed, but the checking of someone who is responsible for two guests and takes that responsibility seriously. The birds, if that was what they were, moved in the high canopy and made sounds that had no reference point in anything Ethan knew. Some of them were almost melodic. One of them, high above and to his left, made a sound that he could only describe as 3 notes descending, then repeated, then shifted by a half step. He stopped for a moment just to listen to it. Owen almost walked into him from behind. "Keep moving," Owen said. "Did you hear that?" "I heard it, keep moving." He kept moving. They walked for about 20 minutes before the trees thinned and they stepped into a second clearing, this one not natural. There were structures here, low and curved, built partly into the hillside on the far side of the clearing, made of a material that looked like stone but was too perfectly smooth to be unworked. The curves of the buildings matched the curves of the landscape, as if whoever had built them had looked at the hill and decided to make something that continued the line rather than interrupted it. There were more of her people here. Ethan stopped counting at 12. They all stopped what they were doing when Vea walked in with 2 humans behind her. The silence was the kind that has weight to it, not hostile, but charged, the way air gets charged before a storm full of potential that has not yet decided which way to go. It was the silence of people who have been waiting for a thing, and are now watching the thing happen, and are not entirely sure yet whether it is happening the way they expected. Ethan kept his hands visible. He kept his breathing steady and his face open. He did not smile. He was not sure what a smile communicated here, but he kept his expression as readable as he could, which was not hard for him, because this was always what his face did. He looked around the clearing without staring at any individual for too long, taking in the whole picture rather than the details. The people here varied in height and the depth of their gray-blue coloring. Some had the silver hair filaments bright and constantly shifting. Others had them stilled and dim, whether from age or disposition he could not tell. Their clothing was varied in configuration but similar in quality, all of it dark, all of it functional, all of it worn with the ease of people who do not think about what they are wearing because what they wear works. They were all watching him and Owen with the same concentrated attention that Vea had used at the cargo bay door, that specific quality of looking at something you have thought about for a very long time and are now finally actually seeing. He recognized it because it was the same thing he had felt at the cargo bay door looking at her. One of the others stepped forward. Older than Vea, with the same gray-blue skin but deeper lines in the face and around the eyes, the kind of lines that come from years of specific expressions repeated so often they become permanent, and the silver filaments of the hair dimmer, less shifting, as if age had settled them into a calmer frequency that did not need to announce itself. This person's eyes were darker than Vea's, more gray than silver, with a quality of assessment in them that was long practiced and thorough. They moved between Ethan and Owen steadily, spending equal time on each of them, not hurrying the evaluation. Ethan had the distinct impression he was being read the way an experienced person reads a situation, completely, without commentary, without revealing what conclusions were being drawn. Then they said something, short and direct, to Vea. Vea answered. Her voice was even and she spoke at some length, and whatever she said seemed to last longer than the question warranted. Toward the end of it, she made a gesture toward Ethan specifically, not pointing, more like indicating as if saying, "He is the relevant one, this is the important detail." The older one looked at Ethan, said something else to Vea. Vea's chin tilted down fractionally. She looked at Ethan from the corner of her eye. And her skin, just barely, began to go red again. Owen cleared his throat beside him, in a way that Ethan chose to absolutely and completely ignore. The older one seemed to accept whatever Vea had said, because the tension in the clearing dropped one measurable degree. People began to move again, returning to whatever they had been doing, though they continued to glance over with the regularity of people who were trying not to stare and not entirely succeeding. It was a very familiar social behavior. Ethan had the strange and grounding thought that watching beings from another world try not to obviously stare at something new was profoundly, unmistakably recognizable. The older one made a gesture that seemed to be an invitation, toward the nearest structure, toward the interior. Ethan glanced at Vea. She gave a small, deliberate nod. He went. Inside, the structure was larger than the exterior suggested, and it had the quality that good architecture always has, which is the quality of feeling inevitable, as if the space could not possibly have been arranged any other way, as if every proportion was the one that the dimensions required rather than the one that someone had chosen. He had been in a lot of buildings. He had never thought about buildings this way before. Something about this one made him think about it. With that same quality, the buildings on the hillside had of continuing the curve of the landscape. The walls were smooth and slightly warm to the near proximity in a way that suggested they retained heat. The ceiling was high enough to feel spacious without being cavernous. There were surfaces that held objects Ethan could not identify, tools or instruments or something between the two, and what might have been documents in a format he did not recognize, and at least 3 things that had the unmistakable quality of machines that were currently running. There was light from sources he couldn't see directly, warm and steady, with no obvious fixtures. The older one produced a device thin, about the size of a credit card, matte gray, and held it flat in one palm. It emitted a soft, low tone, and then from it, in English that was accented but completely and carefully intelligible. "We have been watching your kind for 31 years. Ethan blinked. He looked at Vea, who was standing to one side, watching him with those pale silver eyes and that expression that he could not entirely read. He looked back at the older one. 31 years, he repeated. Your language was not difficult to learn, the older one said, through the device. Your intentions were the difficult part. And what did you decide about our intentions? The older one paused. The device emitted a soft sound, as if processing the weight of the question, or perhaps just the translation of it. We have been debating that question, it said, for 31 years. Owen leaned close to Ethan and said very quietly, in the tone of someone connecting dots in real time, "This explains the clearance delays. Every application we filed, every request for contact permission, someone in the system kept delaying it." It did explain that. It explained quite a lot of things at once. Ethan turned this information over carefully. 31 years of listening, watching, learning a language and still not being able to decide. He thought about what that meant. Not a civilization that was afraid of humans, a civilization that was careful about them. That was a very different thing. And Vea, he said, he nodded toward her. Why did she come to the crash site alone? The older one said something in their language directly to Vea without the device. Vea answered, short and clear. The older one translated. She said she had already made her decision. She had been ready for some time, and she was not willing to wait for the council to finish its argument. Ethan looked at Vea. She was looking back at him, and the red had fully returned. He thought about 31 years of watching and waiting and debating. He thought about a girl who had been ready and had decided that the debate was someone else's problem. He thought about what it took to make that kind of choice, to trust your own assessment so completely that you acted on it before you had permission. He thought he was beginning to understand what kind of person Vea was. He thought he respected it enormously. The device was called, in Vea's language, something Ethan rendered in his head as a bridge tongue. The older one's name was Saron. Not a leader in the political sense, the closest equivalent Ethan could find, working through Saron's careful explanations over the following hours, was something like a lead researcher, or perhaps a senior scientist who had the authority that comes from being the person who knows the most about a subject. Saron had run this observation post for 19 of the 31 years the program had existed, and had more knowledge of human behavior, language, history, and cultural pattern than most humans Ethan had met. That was a strange thing to sit with. It required a mental adjustment he was still working through. The bridge tongue was not a simple translator. It had been built over years by people who had listened to human language in all its forms, recorded, spoken, written, sung, and tried to understand not just what the words meant, but what people meant when they used them, which was often not the same thing. The result was imperfect in places. There were concepts it rendered too literally, and nuances it smoothed over, but it worked well enough to serve as a foundation. "You watched us for 31 years, Ethan said, in the second hour of conversation. He was sitting across from Saron on a low, curved surface that functioned as a seat. Vea was nearby, sometimes listening and sometimes working on something at one of the surfaces, the way a person half attends a conversation that does not require their full participation. But you never made contact." "We made contact twice," Saron said, through the device. "Both times the contact was not understood. It was categorized by your people as equipment malfunction." Owen sat forward slightly. "The signal anomaly at Station 14, 18 months ago." "Yes. That was you." "Yes. We spent 8 months diagnosing that anomaly, 3 engineering teams." The bridge tongue produced a sound for Saron's reply that it rendered as, "We know. We observed the process." There was something in Saron's expression that might have been the equivalent of an apology for the inconvenience, or might have been the equivalent of finding it educational, and Ethan could not tell which. There were more immediate things to discuss: the bent coupling on the shuttle, the nature of the damage. He asked directly. Saron paused. He looked at Vea. Vea looked at the surface she had been working on, not with guilt exactly, but with the expression of someone who has done a considered thing and is prepared to stand fully behind it while also being aware that the standing might be awkward. "She asked us to bring the shuttle down safely," Saron said, through the bridge tongue. Ethan absorbed this. He looked at Vea. "Safely," he repeated. "The margin was calculated in full," Saron said. "Every variable was accounted for. The structural integrity of your vessel was analyzed before the intervention. The landing terrain was selected and cleared of obstructions by our team in advance. The angle and force of the impact on your stabilizer was precise to the minimum necessary. There was no path to harm. Except," Ethan said, keeping his voice even, "the shuttle is totaled and we have been stranded on an uncontacted world for 2 days." "Yes, those outcomes were also calculated." He looked at Vea again. She met his gaze without flinching or looking away. She had the steadiness of someone who had made a decision with full knowledge of its consequences and was not going to pretend she hadn't. He tried to find something to be genuinely angry about and kept running into the same wall, which was this: the shuttle had come down cleanly. He had not been injured. Owen had not been injured. The crash had been survivable in a way that a random accident would statistically not have been, and she had been at the crash site within hours, waiting. It was the most elaborate introduction he had ever received. "Why?" he asked her directly, setting aside the bridge tongue, using the small collection of her language he had, gesture filling in the gaps. "Why this? Why us? Why me?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then she spoke and Saron translated. She said, The debate in our council was going to continue for at least another decade. There is a faction that argues humans are fundamentally unpredictable in ways that make contact too uncertain. She said she believed the best way to resolve the question was to meet a human and determine the answer herself. She chose a moment when the contact could be controlled, where the variables were limited. She chose two people rather than a group. She chose people who did work with their hands, because she had observed that this often correlates with people who deal with reality as it is rather than as they wish it to be. Ethan sat back, and she chose our specific shuttle. She had been observing your outpost for 3 months. She chose you. He said slowly, she chose me specifically. Saran said, she says you have a quality that did not have a word in our language until she described it to the linguistic team and they created one. The bridge tongue renders it as someone who means what they say. Owen had gone still in the way of someone who is feeling multiple things and is choosing not to express any of them. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, through some opening in the structure Ethan could not see directly, the sound of the silver trees came through, that sustained hum of wind through foil leaves, constant and calm. Ethan thought about a crash landing in a silver forest and an alien girl at the edge of a ramp, and the first thing he had said being the honest, unguarded truth, the thought that went from his head to his mouth without stopping anywhere in between. He thought about what it meant, on a world he did not know, to be chosen for the quality of meaning what you say. He looked at Vea. You crashed us on purpose, he said, because you thought I would not lie to you. Saran translated. Vea spoke. Saran translated. She says, she crashed you on purpose because she thought that if you saw something that surprised you, your first response would not be to hide it. She says, she was right. He had no immediate answer for that. He sat with it and turned it over carefully. It was one of those statements that was too large to respond to quickly, the kind that needed to sit in the room for a while before you tried to do anything with it. He thought about what it would have meant to her, and to Saran, and to everyone who had spent 31 years watching and analyzing and cataloging human behavior, to have the central question finally answered not by a report or a committee decision or a carefully engineered diplomatic protocol, but by a man who looked at something beautiful and said so before his own better judgment could intervene. He thought that it was possibly the most useful thing he had ever done by accident. He thought about his first 10 seconds on this planet. He thought about surprise that does not know how to hide itself. He thought about how it had never occurred to him, in all his deployments and all his complicated years, that the inability to keep the truth off his face might be, somewhere, considered a quality worth selecting for. He said, and was she right? Saran translated. Vea smiled, the real version of whatever a smile was for her, the one that involved more of her face than just the area around her mouth, the one that meant something, and she spoke, and Saran translated. She says, you called her gorgeous within 10 seconds of seeing her. She has never been more certain of anything in her life. The afternoon moved slowly after that, in the best possible way. Owen and Saran fell into the first of what would become many long, careful conversations about logistics and protocol, how to bring in the official teams, how to structure the announcement, how to introduce this contact to human governments and to the broader population in ways that would not immediately cause the kind of panic that historically followed surprises of this scale. It was exactly the right conversation to be having, and Owen was exactly the right person to have it. He had the temperament for it, patient, methodical, thorough, capable of staying calm in the middle of information that would have overwhelmed a less organized mind. Ethan sat with Vea outside, in the shifting silver light of the afternoon, and worked on language. She had a different method than Saran. Where Saran used the bridge tongue as a medium, Vea seemed to prefer doing the work directly, pointing at things, trying words in both languages, getting them wrong and trying again, laughing at the wrong ones in the way that is not unkind but is absolutely honest about the limits of everyone involved. When he got a word badly wrong, she would repeat it slowly, adjusting the tone by small degrees each time, watching his face to see when he heard the difference even if he could not yet reproduce it. When he got something right, really right, not just close, something changed in her expression that was quiet and specific and had the quality of genuine pleasure rather than polite approval. It was slower than the bridge tongue. It required more patience from both of them. It also produced something different. The bridge tongue gave you the meaning. The direct method gave you the texture around the meaning, the feeling of the words, the weight they carried, the experience of having reached for something and found it with your own hands rather than having it handed to you already assembled. Her people he was learning piece by piece had a concept that did not translate neatly into English. The closest he could get, working through broken words and gestures and Saren's occasional assistance, was something like chosen sight, the quality of being seen by someone who has decided to look, not being noticed accidentally, not being studied from a distance, being looked at by someone who chose to look at you and in looking decided to stay. It was different from observation. It was different from attention. It was something more specific and more weighted, the experience of knowing that a person had looked at you on purpose, not because you were in front of them, not because you were making noise or taking up space, but because they had made a choice to direct their full awareness toward you, and that what they had seen had been enough to make them decide you were worth more of their time. He thought about how rare that was, actually. He thought about how often people look at each other without seeing each other, how observation and attention and genuine sight are three entirely different things that people frequently confuse. He thought about how many people he had met in his life, and how few of them had ever made him feel that specific thing, that particular quality of being looked at by someone who had chosen to look. He thought that Vea had made him feel it from the moment she had appeared at the cargo bay door. That was why he had said what he'd said. Not because she was striking, though she was, because she was looking at him, really looking, and something in him had recognized it and responded without permission. He thought about 31 years of watching from a safe and careful distance, building a language and a body of knowledge and a picture of a species, and still not knowing what to do with it. He thought about all the reports and all the data and all the careful measured observation, and how none of it had answered the question that mattered, which was, are they worth meeting? He thought about one girl who had decided to walk out of the trees, because she was done waiting for the answer to come from a document. He thought about what it costs to decide something before you have permission to decide it, and then to act on it. He thought about the kind of conviction that requires not recklessness, which is easy, but the slower, harder certainty of someone who has thought it through and arrived at a conclusion, and is prepared to stand in the open with that conclusion and let it be tested. He thought he was understanding what she had given him when she came to the cargo bay door and waited for him to see her. She had not just introduced herself. She had made a case. She had said, with her presence and her patience and the steady way she had held his gaze, I decided you were worth this. See if you can show me I was right. Late in the afternoon, she pointed at his face and said a word he had not heard before. What does that mean? He asked. She tried to explain it without any tools. He caught fragments. He went inside, borrowed the bridge tongue from Saren for 60 seconds, and asked her to say it again with the device between them. The bridge tongue rendered it, after a moment's processing, as the expression someone has when they are paying attention to something they consider beautiful. He handed the bridge tongue back to Saren and walked back outside without comment. She was waiting. The light was going amber and warm, and the silver trees in that light were something else entirely, not shimmering like foil now but glowing from within, as if the light had gotten inside them and found something worth illuminating. She was sitting with that easy posture of hers, the kind of stillness that is not rigid but fully rested, and she was watching him the way she always watched him, which was to say, like she had decided to and was not going to pretend otherwise. He sat back down across from her. He said carefully in her language, getting most of it right this time, the tones almost true, the word for sky, and then the word for color, and then the word she had just taught him without meaning to. Her skin went red from the collar to the hairline, fast and complete. He had said, "Your eyes are the color of a sky that someone finds beautiful." He had said it in her language imperfectly, with the wrong tone on the third syllable and probably the wrong rhythm on the last word. But he had meant it fully, with nothing held back, because he was who he was, which was someone who could not keep true things from coming out of his mouth. She spoke, and this time the words were slow and clear enough that he caught them without help. She said, "Say it again." The rescue team arrived on day 3, 4 hours ahead of schedule because Owen had managed to boost the beacon signal using parts from the camp stove, combined with a component from the shuttle's emergency radio backup, which was both resourceful and entirely characteristic of Owen Pratt, who had been solving problems with whatever was available since the day Ethan had met him. 3 ships came in over the silver trees, their running lights making strange colors against the purple sky. Medical personnel, equipment teams. 2 senior officials from the Colonial Relations Office who had been contacted during transit and were already composing communiques to people on 7 different governing bodies, their tablets lit and their expressions carrying the weight of people who understand that they are participating in something that will be written about for a very long time. A communications specialist named Laura, who arrived with a field translation rig that could process tonal language patterns in real time and made the bridge tongue look like a child's first effort at a difficult problem, though Ethan felt protective of the bridge tongue in a way he did not entirely examine. And Director K, who ran colonial relations for the entire northern sector and had been doing this work for 22 years, and who walked toward Ethan while reading the preliminary incident report on a tablet and got approximately to the 3rd paragraph, before she looked up at him with the expression of a person who does not know whether to be deeply impressed or quietly furious, and who has decided to hold that question open for the time being. "You called her gorgeous," Director K said. "Yes," Ethan said. "In the first 10 seconds of contact." "Yes." She looked back at the tablet, read for another moment, looked back up at him, and she asked you to say it again. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment that had a lot of thoughts moving through it. Around them, the camp had transformed into something resembling a coordinated operation, with equipment and people moving in organized patterns, and Saran meeting the colonial relations team with a calm and measured quality that suggested 31 years of preparation, had produced exactly the kind of readiness that was needed for this moment. Owen was somewhere in the middle of all of it, giving someone what was clearly a very thorough debrief, his field notebook open in his hand. "Dr. Harmon's cultural briefing team," Director K said, returning to the tablet, "has been working through the night based on the preliminary data Owen transmitted. They indicate that among Vea's people, the reddening of the skin in response to being directly acknowledged for appearance is a significant social marker." She read for a moment more. "They have a term for it. The bridge tongue renders the concept as something close to recognition. It is distinct from a simple compliment. It carries the weight of being seen as a full person, as someone whose reality is real to the one who speaks." Ethan said nothing. He was listening carefully. "It is, according to the briefing, one of the more significant social signals in their culture," she continued. "To cause it in someone is to have acknowledged their existence in a way that their society considers meaningful. It is not romantic necessarily, though it is not that, depending on context. It is fundamentally an act of seeing someone completely and saying so." She lowered the tablet. "You did not know any of this." "No," he agreed. And yet the response was correct. "Apparently." She looked at him for a long moment. The silver trees moved in the morning wind and made their humming sound, and the new equipment was going up around the camp, and the world that had never had a human on it was in the process of changing in a way that could not be changed back. And Director K, who had 22 years of navigating exactly these kinds of moments, said, "Corporal Cole, I have helped write 3 first contact protocol documents. I have been present at 2 successful contacts and 3 failed ones. I have read every analysis ever produced on first contact communication strategy. She paused. None of those documents account for the scenario where the single most important thing you said was an accident. He said, "Is that a compliment?" She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "It is an observation," she said, and walked away towards Saran and her team with the measured stride of a person who has too much to do and is already doing it. The day was full in the way that significant days always are, packed so completely, with things that need to happen that there is no room to step back and appreciate that any of it is happening at all. There were formal introductions. Saran meeting the colonial relations officials with the bridge tongue and with 31 years of patient knowledge, and the officials meeting that knowledge with the specific kind of professional respect that people give to someone who simply knows more than they do and has the quiet evidence to prove it. There were preliminary agreements discussed, frameworks proposed, schedules for the formal contact process established over the coming months. It was large, careful, slow work, the kind that is not dramatic in the moment but that turns out to matter enormously over the years that follow. But the work of hours and days was happening alongside the larger work. Laura had Vea speaking into the translation rig by mid-morning, and Vea took to it with the same rapid, precise interest she brought to every new tool, learning its patterns, testing its limits, finding the places where it got things exactly right, and the places where it smoothed over something that deserved more precision. By midday she could use it well enough to have her first full conversation with Director K without Saran present, which was a milestone that Laura declared significant, and then immediately added 3 more hours to her own schedule to analyze. Director K, for her part, handled the conversation with Vea with the careful competence of 22 years in this field. She asked questions that were open rather than leading. She listened rather than filling silences, and she came out of the conversation with notes that covered 4 pages and an expression that said she was reevaluating several things she had previously thought she understood about what contact would look like when it finally happened. Owen found Ethan in the afternoon, sitting at the edge of the camp where the silver trees started, eating a food pack and watching the light change in the canopy. "How are you doing?" Owen asked, sitting down beside him. "Fine," Ethan said. "Strange fine." "Both of those are accurate," Owen agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "You know they're going to want to debrief you very thoroughly when we get back." "I know. And the report is going to be read by a lot of people." "I know that too." Owen picked up a small stone from the ground, turned it over in his fingers, put it down. "The part where you called her gorgeous in the first 10 seconds is going to be in every version of that report." "I assumed." "It's probably going to be in the history books." Ethan ate another bite of the food pack and said nothing. Owen said, "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. I don't mean the accident. I mean the choice you've made every hour since. The way you've talked to her, the way you've treated all of them." He paused. "You were exactly what she needed to see." Ethan sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "She needed to see someone who couldn't keep his mouth shut." "She needed to see someone who wasn't afraid of the truth," Owen said. "There's a difference." There was a difference. He sat with it for a moment and felt the truth of it settle. The afraid of honesty version of a person was not a dishonest person necessarily. It was someone who had learned that honesty had costs and had developed systems to manage those costs, careful timing, strategic omission, the art of being technically accurate without being fully transparent. It was a completely rational adaptation. Most people develop some version of it over time. He had tried to develop it at various points in his life, and had found he was simply not built for it, the same way some people are not built for working in confined spaces or keeping plants alive. Vea had watched decades of human behavior through recordings and data, and had somehow identified that specific quality in him, had picked him from a full roster because his particular inability to manage his own reactions was readable even from a distance, even through equipment, even across species. He found that both deeply strange and genuinely moving. "There is a report I am going to have to file about all of this," he said. "I know," Owen said. "The official one. With the formal language." "Yes." "Which means someone at Colonial Relations is going to read a document stating that the first words spoken in the first successful first contact between humans and this species were said accidentally, about appearance, in the first 10 seconds. Owen was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "and then they are going to read the cultural analysis section that explains why those specific words were the correct ones, and that will be a very unusual afternoon for whoever has to write that section." Ethan thought about it. He thought about 31 years of waiting and one girl who decided she was done. "Owen," he said. "Yeah. I think she is one of the most remarkable people I have ever met." Owen looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who knew this already but was glad to hear it said out loud. "I know," he said, "and based on the past 3 days, I am fairly certain she thinks the same thing about you, which, honestly, is the better half of the story." There was a difference. He was going to keep thinking about that. Vea found him later, when the light was going amber and the activity in the camp had settled into the quieter rhythms of late afternoon. She was wearing different clothing, same practical configuration, but a different arrangement of tools at the belt, as if she had prepared for a day that required specific things. She walked to where he was sitting and sat down next to him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, which for her people, he had learned that afternoon from Saran, was a gesture of something between companionship and trust. You did not sit that close to someone you were uncertain about. For a while neither of them said anything. The silver trees moved. The amber light deepened. Somewhere behind them the camp murmured with the sounds of people doing careful, important work. Vea spoke in English, with the deliberate care of someone assembling words one at a time. "It is the first day of a long thing." He looked at her. She was looking at the trees. Her skin was its normal gray-blue, calm and settled, the silver of her hair shifting softly in the warm end-of-day wind. The red was gone. She looked like a person who is entirely comfortable with where they are and what they have done. He said, in her language, the pronunciation almost right now, the tones close enough that she did not wince at them anymore, the thing he had been working on since the night before. "Then I am glad it started the way it did." She turned to look at him. The redness came slowly this time, not the startled rush of that first afternoon, but something quieter and more settled, rising up through the gray-blue like warmth that knew it had time, like something that was not in any hurry to be gone. She spoke, and he understood it without any device between them. She said, "You are still paying attention." He said, "I intend to keep paying attention." She said, "Then say it again, Ethan." He looked at her. He saw her not an alien, not a first contact, not a diplomatic event or a historical moment or a subject in any report anyone was ever going to write. He saw a person who had spent 31 years on the edges of a decision and had finally walked out of the trees. He saw someone who had chosen a specific human because she had decided he was worth the risk of being seen clearly. He said she was gorgeous. He said it in English and then in her language as best he could, and then in the half-language, half-gesture combination that was entirely theirs, built from 3 days of broken words and patient repetition and honest, unguarded attention. He said it the way he always had, the way a person says the true thing before they can think better of it, and she went beautifully, completely, unstoppably red. In the years that followed, the official record of first contact with the people of Renova 6 would describe the event in careful, formal language. It would note the date and the location, and the names of the Colonial Relations officers present. It would outline the initial cultural exchange protocols and the framework agreements on communication and mutual observation that were signed in the months after the crash. It would discuss the 31 years of prior observation, the methods and the patience of Saran's team, the remarkable scope of linguistic preparation that had made the contact possible. It would use the measured, accurate language of people who understand they are writing something permanent. It would not mention that the whole thing started with a burning shuttle, a cup of instant soup, and one soldier who genuinely could not keep a true thing from coming out of his mouth at the wrong moment. But Vea would mention it. For the rest of her life, whenever she told the story to her colleagues at the observation post, to the members of the council who had wanted to wait another decade, to the human researchers and linguists who came in the years after to study her people's language, to the children of both species who grew up in a world where this contact had already happened and wanted to know how it had begun, she would always tell it the same way. She would say, "A ship came out of the sky on fire. 2 humans walked out of it. One of them looked at me and said the first completely honest thing that anyone has said in the first 10 seconds of a first meeting in the entire history of our program." And then she would smile, the real version, the one that used her whole face, the one that looked nothing like a human smile but meant absolutely everything a smile is supposed to mean, and she would say. I asked him to say it again, and he did, and everything that came after was just the rest of the story.